Thanks very much for joining us for episode 15 of InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, and on this episode, we're doing a just after mid-year check-in on the freight market with a couple of familiar faces or voices. Let's get started. It's useful to check in from time to time on the state of freight. The subject was featured on one of our early episodes, and now that we're a bit past the halfway point in 2023, it's a good time to see how things have evolved and whether the consensus at the start of the year matches where things stand now. To discuss, we're having a bit of a roundtable, or triangle table since there's only three of us. Joining me are my two co-hosts, InTek President Shelli Austin and InTek CEO Rick LaGore, marking the first time all three of us have been on the podcast at the same time.
All right.
This is episode 15, and it'll be it's the first one, so.
Epic.
Yeah. We actually had plans to do it early, but then things didn't work out, and then, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, we're ready to go on this one for sure.
Okay, so we'll start with each of you, and Shelli, we'll ask this one to you first. Very broadly, how would you describe what you're seeing in the freight market today? I actually thought about asking this as, give me like one word or three words or something like that, but I don't know if that would...
Oh, I like the one word because that's what I put in my notes.
All right, let's start with the one word.
Chaos. I mean, it is... do you want me to just stick with one word? No. Just kidding. So no, I would... That's the best I could describe the freight market right now is chaos. The other thing I would probably throw right behind it is more of a roller coaster effect, because when you think you've figured it out, it's totally different. And in our world, it used to be you could kind of get a sense of the market and know how to deal with the market, but it doesn't seem that way. So that's why I figure it's complete chaos. We're pulling our hair out, or in my sense, coloring my hair. And, that's how we're living today.
Yeah.
Well, it's a little late for me to color my hair, being completely white-haired at this point in time.
The listeners can trust that that's true.
That is
check out our photos on the website.
Yes, there's no hiding it at this point. But at least I still have hair, so that's what I'm going with, and that's what I'm going to stick with. But in terms of one word from me, I would go from downside. We are on the downside of a cyclical market, but as we'll talk a little bit later, we feel that we're at the very bottom of it and looking for some upside. Just to play off a little bit of what Shelli said on the chaos thing, part of that thing that's going on in the chaos thing as well is that there seems to be alliances being made between different carriers that you didn't expect to have certain alliances with, and it's changing just the overall structure of some of the freight markets, whether or not you're looking at intermodal or you're looking on the truckload side. You're just seeing, as I said, different alliances being, it kind of seems like we're playing Survivor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Strange bedfellows, I guess. Right? So both of you have been in the industry for a while. We won't ask you to say how long.
Thank you.
How does this current environment compare? I know, Rick, we talk a lot about the fact that you just said cyclical in your first answer. So, and you talk about sort of the length of time of these cycles. Is this any different is it sticking out in any kind of way compared to other down periods of these cycles, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, we'll stick to those 1 and 2 word answers first and try to go from there. I would say this cycle is going a little bit deeper in terms of the overall downturn, in terms of volume, and in terms of pricing. It really has been a price war out there, particularly in the last 6 months. So that's my one word there. And the other part is we'll have to stick with 2 words here, and that's longer cycle. So typically we see things change about 12 to 18 months. And for us, being a mid-tier, mid-size type logistics company, we tend to see the downturn before everybody sees it, and we tend to see it after everyone starts to see it going the other direction. So for us, last week marked the annual, let's call it a birthday of when we saw the downturn.
Did you celebrate?
No, it really wasn't a celebration.
There was no champagne.
No. Budgets don't allow for that right now because we're in a downturn of the cycle. But we typically see it goes to 12 to 18 months. A lot of the folks at the beginning of the year and at the end of last year were saying, well, second half, and we were even in that camp, second half is going to be better because we were hoping that it was going to be a 12-month turn. Now, as we look at things, we think of it more as it's going to be more of a close to a 24 months, because now we're talking second half of next year, or the first half of next year, second quarter of that is when we see probably something. But we'll get into details why we believe that. But I think a lot of it gets to that the reason why the downturn is deeper and it is lasting longer is because the disruption that we had this time around lasted much longer because of the pandemic, drove a higher and stronger cycle than we've ever seen in the past. And so that's why it's going to take some more time, because a lot of what happened there is people bought so much stuff.
Yeah.
And you only can buy so much stuff that we're actually going to fit into your home. And we're kind of finished buying stuff.
Except for on Prime days.
Yes.
Except for on Prime days.
Except on Prime days.
For the listeners, I just learned about Prime days and almost not in time, but don't worry, I got in there, so we're good.
Yes, except for Prime days. And actually, it was each Prime day is actually better than the last year's Prime day, and so this was the best that Amazon
Which
had.
really helps our industry.
And I really think that our family personally was trying to change around the overall economy based off of what we were purchasing, because not only were we purchasing for some needs now, we were actually buying Christmas presents for later in the year.
There you go.
Yeah.
So anyway.
We're all contributing.
Yeah, we were trying our damnedest. So anyway. But anyway, so it's that's why why we see it as a little bit longer, and the cuts have been deeper than typical.
Well, and Shelli, I mean, you just, in your first answer, mentioned some things that felt a little unprecedented to you. So expand on that a little bit in terms of how this one feels compared to others. Yeah,
I mean, so anybody that knows Rick and I, he looks at a different version of what I look at, but it's all kind of the same thing, but we kind of look at it in different perspectives. So, Rick's very much in the economics and in the numbers and in the global side of what's going on. And for myself, it's all about how it feels at the time, and how our customers are reacting and how our carriers are reacting, and that's kind of where our market impact, how I get the market impact. And I would say yes, it's unprecedented, but only unprecedented in certain areas, for the fact that one of the things Rick mentioned, which I think is very important, is that these things that we're going through are not things we haven't seen before. They're just longer, and they're not in the same cycle or rotation. So I guess what I'm saying is, we always hear, well, it's the shipper's world right now, or it's the carrier's world right now. And, when we've gone through these times, these cycles before, we still kept that baseline of, you have contracted rates or you're on spot and so on and so forth. It didn't matter if it was the shipper's world or the carrier's world. Well, the problem is, because of how long the situation, the pandemic or whatever caused, our upturn, because of how long those have lasted, that whole cycle has been disrupted. And so it's not the shippers that disrupted it, or it's not the carriers that disrupted it. Everybody disrupted it. And so it's going to take longer for it to get back into that symmetry of how people operate. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing. So, the problem is, everybody's out there saying, well, when rates were really, really high, you were, gouging us during the pandemic, and rates were really, really high, and now it's our turn. And it's really not a your turn, my turn situation. But unfortunately, we got out of this cycle of where there's these commitments and everybody holds to them because of this. And that's what's causing a lot of the disruption in the market, I think, because what I see, traditionally you would always see truck rates are low, and they're winning over intermodal, and then you would see it flip, but it flipped all together. Everything flipped. Now in this little city, truck rates are low and intermodal's great, but over here in this city, it's totally opposite. So there's absolutely no rhyme or reason, and it could be this week it's this way, but next week it's this way. Yeah. And so it's totally different in that sense for us, is being able to gauge. We always go to Rick and say, okay, Rick, when are we going to hit the bottom, and when are we going to make that shift? And we plan for that shift. Well, we can't shift every week, and it's really hard. And we're out there trying to find these, stay in front of these situations with the market to better solution for our customers. But, you have no idea if what we're finding on our solutions is, the same that somebody else is finding for their solutions. And that's what the problem is. I feel like right now is it would be better if we were all in the same playing, on the same field. But unfortunately, we're not all playing on the same field right now.
Well, you mentioned like a city by city thing. Is there sort of a balance issue happening where maybe one week something is, one way and the next week something's another way just because of the volume being so wonky?
Wonky. That's good. Wonky.
That's a scientific word.
I like wonky. I think it's a lot of things, Kevin, to be honest with you. And I'll just give the, Shelli's grade school version and Rick can give the Einstein version. But, for what we see, it's not specific to regions all the time, right? Because California is a good example. I mean, California was, the rates were extremely low coming out of there on truck. And I mean, low to where people have never seen low. And I think a lot of that is just the impacts of international and what the ports are doing and so on and so forth. But produce, the truck rates started getting higher. And so nobody really knew how to jump into that because there were so low rates, right? And then some areas in California, the truck rates are still really low. So I really think it's a matter of, is it an asset carrier? For intermodal, I think I personally feel like for intermodal, we're getting to some consistency, but it's different, right? Because it's kind of a one-way thing. Even though you can connect some stuff up and be pretty cool on your dray, rail is kind of a one-way thing. But for trucking, it's these guys bought all these assets. And I think that plays into it a lot. Rick said, everybody stopped buying items in retail. Well, yeah, everybody bought a bunch of assets too at the same time that everybody was buying a lot for themselves. And what's happening is, these folks that bought all these assets, they're sitting in certain places and then they get them moved. And then all of a sudden they've created another problem because they're sitting in those certain places. So I feel like the shift of rates are moving and you can't really, gauge or commit or do anything with what you see one day because it's going to change the next day. And I think that's really been the biggest challenge. So I personally don't see any consistency to where one's stronger than the other. It fluctuates from maybe not week to week, but certainly from month to month. It continues to fluctuate.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned the intermodal versus truckload in terms of rates and everything. There's usually a push and pull kind of thing. We do a lot of intermodal. You actually track them, particularly the rates. So Rick, tell us sort of where that is right now and how that's evolved over the course of the year.
Yeah, so, Shelli called me Einstein, so I'm going to go with that. Or maybe she didn't call me Einstein, but she said my answers are Einstein-like.
Ish, yes.
Yeah, so I'm not really Einstein. But in any case, so let's just take a look at the numbers just a little bit, and we're not going to do too many of them, but take a look at, say, truckload spot rate and intermodal spot rate. So truckload spot rate right now is down right around 23%, depending on who you look at. And then on the intermodal side, it's down 27%, so fairly close. One of the things that plays into both of them, that really has played on some of the deflationary things that we've seen as of late, is that fuel is down 29.9%. Mm-hmm. So that has had a huge impact on the rates on the all-in side. And what we've really seen is that over this course of this downturn, truckload tends to move faster on rates going down than intermodal. And that's because truckload it's a really fast group of people and very segmented, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's something like 97% of the market of truckload capacity is made up of carriers that have 20 or fewer trucks. I believe that's what the number is. So it's very fragmented. And so there's a lot of owner-operators type small family businesses that, they immediately need that cash on the table to feed their families and buy stuff that they need to support their families. Mm-hmm. Versus in the intermodal side, it tends to move a little bit slower because it's much different in that essentially 5 players make up about 85% of the market play out there.
Yeah.
So these are huge companies with huge balance sheets. They have the patience to move a little bit slower and not have to do the immediate reaction, oh crap, I got to cover this. Oh crap, I got to cover this bill. They've got it. So, and that's kind of why we've seen just recently, we've started to see the flip, and that really occurred in the second quarter of this year, where truckload rates in some of these markets are now more expensive than the intermodal rates. As Shelli was mentioning earlier, we saw these rates go crazy low, and then they pop up here, and it's kind of playing whack-a-mole across the country as these things go. But as you take a look at the total dollar figures, you're really starting to see that intermodal is coming back as a play, not just on capacity, but also on price.
So you mentioned wherever you look, we have our own intermodal index. Where are some other places that people can look to do some of the following of the numbers?
Well, there's a couple places, and it depends if you want to pay or if you don't want to pay. If you're looking not to pay, I think one of the best places to actually look is if you've got a strategic logistics partner, because like us, we get a bunch of paid stuff that comes in here. So this is where we gather all of our information to make our Einstein answers. Still have to play in that a little bit because that's kind of funny. Plays off on the white hair, although it doesn't stick up. But
we can take care of that.
Yeah, light socket. In any case, so if you have a trusted and strategic logistics partner, they have a lot of that information that they're willing to share with you and get there. Some other places that give you some directional information that's really good, and a lot of people follow it, is CAS. That's a great place to check out truckload spend, truckload direction on rates. It's a great index. One that I really am a fan of is the Coyote Curve. They do a great job in terms of pulling information together, and the analysis they put in there, they make it super simple. Again, a free piece of information. Check out our LinkedIn site. We're always posting stuff. Again, if there's free stuff and you don't want to go out there on the website trying to find, okay, well, we just heard this in the podcast. We're always putting stuff out there to help people. If you're on a paid side, one of the places that I think is great is the Journal of Commerce. I think they've got some of the best editorial and investigative reporting out there. They stay away from some of those adjectives that sensationalize or either on an upside or a downside in any market. They also have out there on their paid side, they have statistics. They measure truckload rates, they measure intermodal rates, they measure freight air rates, they measure ocean rates all over the globe. So that's a great place if you want to pay to get some great information and get all their articles are essentially paid articles. Mm-hmm. And as I said, they're great articles out there. So there's a few places, paid and non-paid.
So shifting away from the statistics, Shelli,
I'm glad you shifted away from the statistics.
You talked about, shippers, brokers. I mean, we've got every player in the market is dealing with it in their own way. So what are some of those sort of frontline reactions that you've seen from the different players that you work with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough for everybody. I mean, there's not a single player in this supply chain that this isn't tough for, and that's what we all have to realize and recognize. And I think, when I say tough, in a broker sense, you have to be super protective of the partners that you're working with, because unfortunately, in times like these, and you've heard it all over, the social media and the news and everything, fraud is increased quite a bit. And, you would like to think that everybody's ethical and reasonable and honest, but it's just not the case, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So you have to protect from that. And I think that's scary for a lot of the folks on the front line, because we're afraid to do our jobs the best that we can do, because we're afraid we're going to make a mistake and let something bad come in. So I think that, that's where a lot of folks are at that heightened anxiety and awareness and everything that's going on, whether it be on the brokerage side, on the carrier side, or even on the shipper side, because everybody's been burnt. Mm-hmm. If you haven't been burnt, then you're not moving very much product. I mean, it's just as simple as that. So I think that it is tough, and really what we are focusing on here is you have to go old school a little bit. I talk about that a lot, but even in these tough times, even when there's rate wars, there are some things you can't control, but the things that you can control, there are things that you really have to focus on and make those even better. And that's, just the communication, proactiveness, and just stay in front of things. So don't ever be afraid to go find a new solution for your customer. Don't let them, don't let things rest on what they were before or what they have been. You got to constantly be out there looking for new things, new solutions, and you do have to be careful, but we're all in this together, and just eventually it won't all go away. It'll always be there. I think it always was there, right? Unfortunately, just the things that we went through with the pandemic and everything just has exposed it, and it's at a very high level right now, so we just have to walk through it. But yeah, there's not a rosy picture for anybody, but the cool thing about it is I guess cool if you say it in that way, is we're not out there alone. We're all in it together. So let's just work through it together.
The relationships really have to matter when you're talking about the cycles that you mentioned some people coming to you back in the peak period where, this is way high and now it's way low, or they want it to be way lower.
Yeah.
Developing that trust between parties is really, really a key too.
It is. And hey, you got to develop the trust, and you do develop really strong relationships. But you also have to realize that everybody is in a particular position in their job, and they have to make sure that they're protecting that position. And that's where I think you have to empathize for all sides, right? So you can't think, oh, well, I did this for you, yesterday. Why aren't you doing this for me today? We just can't think like that anymore. I mean, yes, we build these relationships for a reason, and that's because we're all going to work together on moving forward with solutions. Mm-hmm. But you have to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward to get those right solutions for the end goal of everybody. And sometimes that's really, really hard. So it's one of those things. And I think you recognize that in our world a lot, right? Being a 3PL. Because we're kind of that middle party putting all the parts and pieces together. And I think we have a lot more exposure to every segment of the supply chain than what certain areas have exposure to. So hopefully we learn from things and we do better each time that we learn from them.
And you can kind of shield the other parties in some way.
Boy, we try. We try. Sometimes we miss it a bit, but the whole thing is to try and fix things and make sure that it's kind of always called Rick the Oz behind the curtain, right? We got to be the folks that are behind the curtain making things happen to where it's almost a rosy picture on the other side of it.
Yeah,
the best that
just happens.
The best that we can get it there, right? Mm-hmm. So it's fun, but it's challenging, and sometimes you don't get as much sleep as you wanted to get, but that's the game. That's the world we live in.
So, Rick, you mentioned this was like just had the 1 year birthday of the downturn, basically. And you mentioned coming into the year, a lot of people were maybe wish casting that it would be halfway through the year and everything would get back to normal. So did you, at that time, you think, like, look back to yourself in December, January, what were you thinking was going to happen versus what's actually happened?
So we were wishful hoping that everybody else was right. It turning around in 12 months. In terms of our budgeting, though, since we've seen these things last at least 18 months, we were at least budgeting and planning for that all of this year was going to be a bit difficult because it's both a supply issue, meaning too much 53-foot capacity out there in the marketplace today, and it's also a demand issue as consumers have flipped over from buying physical items to buying experiences. So you see travel and dining out, and you see those numbers going through the roof. Yeah. So that's kind of why but that's why we planned that it was going to be all the way through the year. So yes, we were wishful with everybody else, but yeah, planned differently.
Let's talk about the cycle piece a little bit more. So you've given us some pretty good overview of like the timelines that we usually see. I think it's just at this point, the cycle is still the cycle, but we just had a higher peak, a longer peak, and now we're at a lower valley. That's probably going to be a longer valley too.
Yeah, so there's really, at this point in time, 4 things that we're really looking at. So we're looking at what's happening in the spot rate market, in the truckload side and the intermodal side. Is it still decreasing at an accelerating rate, or is it flattening out? So that's number 1. And right now, we have seen it flatten out. Interesting, though, it also, while you're looking at these spot rates, it's very interesting that the trend of 2023 is very much following the trend of 2019. So pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, those years look very similar. As a matter of fact, if you take out fuel, because we just had Dean Croak on here from DAT, and he was talking about it's only a couple pennies difference. We're seeing the same thing on the intermodal side. It's only a couple pennies difference at this time once you take out fuel. So very similar. And the trend of it going down throughout the year and flattening out, we've seen in both years. Yeah. So the other part we're looking at is destocking inventories, which, how much does the retailers have? I know we had a good chunk of business that we were providing extra warehousing across the country for different people that we work with because they had way too much inventory because people were afraid that they weren't going to get it into the ports for their consumers or for their customers. So there's still a lot of excess inventory out there, or it may be the inventory level looks right, but they don't have the right stuff to sell for this year, or they're in the wrong season. We started to see that improve, but it's starting to look like it's going back up again. So that's not really positive. Okay, that's another part that we want to see on the bottoming. We want to see that destocking be down to a level where, okay, now it's time to go ahead and replenish the inventories for your customers. The other thing that we like to look at, there's a couple other things, and it's really more on the trucking side itself, and that's to look at Class 8 truck orders. Typically, people will stop buying trucks. There's no need to add additional capacity, or they're just tightening their budget here for a bit because they're at a downturn and they don't want to go ahead and start cycling through some of the older trucks and bringing in new ones. We still haven't seen that stop yet. So I would expect that we would start to see some canceling orders in the fourth quarter, but we haven't seen any of that yet. So there's still upturn on that. But it is slowing down. So that's a good thing. The fourth thing that we look at on the trucking side is operating authorities. And we look at the net increase or decrease on the operating authorities. Meaning, is more trucking capacity being added from these guys that have 20 or fewer trucks, or is it declining? And starting, I believe it was March of this year, we started to see the net number actually go negative. And it's held negative now since March, and it really needs to be held negative, which is unfortunate, but it's going to need to go negative a little bit more because, again, it's a supply and a demand issue, and there's just still too much supply of capacity out there. On the intermodal side, you can hear from the Class 1 railroads, or I think it was J.B. Hunt that just reported earnings yesterday, where J.B. Hunt said roughly they're parking 20% of the containers that they have out there. They're not putting them out in the marketplace. And then we know the Class 1s have done the same thing, and some of the other asset players have parked their inventory of containers as well. So we just need to wait for that continue to play out a little bit. So we're not at the bottom yet, but the bottom certainly looks like it's close because we've seen that the spot rates flatten. We just need to see these other three items really make a change for it.
And then it's a question of how long we stay at the bottom before things start to...
Yeah, and right now we're kind of looking at the bottom's going to stay in for a bit because there is nothing in the foreseeable future that's a catalyst on demand. So, okay, we took care of the supply side of truckload capacity and intermodal capacity, but people still need to buy stuff for that to go ahead and go the other direction. Yeah. So there's not really a catalyst out there at this point in time that we can see. I mean, we can take some guesses at things that might cause a catalyst, but who knew that the pandemic was going to be a catalyst? There's just so many things that drive catalysts that you don't know. I mean, one year it was a polar vortex. Another year it was hurricanes that caused some balancing issues and caused the freight to be a problem there for a bit.
Are there any happy catalysts?
There are happy catalysts.
You just went through some pretty bleak ones.
We're waiting for it.
So that the happy catalyst is, we did see a pretty big, strong increase in the economy. What was that, over 2017, 2018? And that was funny because when that was happening, the people that were in the industry, and I won't say how long I have been, but it's extended, said that we've never seen such strong demand for trucking. Never saw it. This is the highest I've ever seen it in my 40 years. And then a couple years later, boom, 2020, 21, all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this is the highest I've ever seen it. I've never seen it this high before.
It's unprecedented.
It's unprecedented. And that's exactly what we're saying in 2017, 2018.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just don't know what it is, and you don't know what that turn is going to be or that catalyst is going to be in the economy to shoot it up the other direction. Now, granted, right now the Federal Reserve is working awfully hard to tamp all that down with their unprecedented increases on rates. So that's definitely, they're working against it while the government is still throwing money into it. We've got a lot of federal funding going into infrastructure and roads, and we haven't seen all that money funnel into the states yet. So there's still a lot of money coming in while the Federal Reserve is trying to tamp it down.
I guess the other thing is people have to feel like the stuff that they bought the last couple of years needs to be replaced, right? So
at some point, yeah.
Either that or it's in a garage sale, and then the space opens up to go buy something different.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So I don't know. In terms of that build-up piece, then it's not going to be like a finger snap kind of thing where everything's back to normal right away. We're talking, you've already given some...
Will that work?
Timelines. Right. Check the phones, check the emails.
Thought I'd give it a try. Sorry, Kevin.
We're still talking a bit of time before we get to the bottom, how long we're at the bottom, then it's going to be more of like a climb, a gradual kind of climb most likely, right?
Most likely, yes. I mean, we're looking at stuff, Some people talk about housing because it tends to punch above its level because of all the parts and pieces that's required to build a house. That could be. I mean, we're still seeing that a lot of the home builders are, you take a look at their stock, they're like through the roof because they're building at unprecedented levels. I like that word now that Shelli brought it into the conversation a few minutes back.
Maybe or something.
I've been able to go ahead and hit that a couple times.
Unprecedented.
Yes.
I've got two.
Yeah, two. And so there's a piece. Another piece people are talking about is reshoring. If we're going to reshore, that means we're going to have to build up some manufacturing facilities or retool manufacturing facilities that were mothballed or at a lower level. So that might be another catalyst. Another catalyst, maybe interest rates will start to decline because the overall market has been pushed down enough that the Federal Reserve feels that the interest rates have done their thing and the inflation is now at a level that they feel comfortable with. I mean, those are just three, but who the heck knows what it really is going to be? Maybe it's Shelli snapping her fingers. We'll go ahead and turn on the economy.
That would be great. I think one thing that we talk about rate, and as we're talking that it's going to be a slow recovery, one of the things that you would hope would be happening is during a downtime, that's when people focus on improvements in service. And because it's not that, I don't care what it takes to get it, just do it or just cover it. And, we see that in some instances. We've seen a lot of improvements in service on rail, which is good. But I tend to be wary about that only because I think that the railroads run best when they have a lot of volume on them. So it would be nice to put it to the test, get that volume back and really see if the improvements in service that we're seeing are really solid and truthful, which we hope they are, because I do know that the railroads have invested a ton on their infrastructure. Where I hope that comes into play soon is in the truck market. Although we speak a lot about intermodal, we do a lot of truck as well. So we watch it very closely, and we do have some strong truck lanes. And the concerning part about that is you would think since things were slower that they would be, doing their PMs and working on their equipment and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, in this situation, operating costs have not gone down and even have gone up, where rates have gone way down. So all that additional cost to keep the equipment intact, unfortunately, I think is getting put aside because we're seeing a lot more breakdowns, a lot more equipment failures and those types of things on the truck side. So as we talk about it's slow and that gradual slow, the hopes are that, people start focusing on the service and the equipment and getting it to when we do make that turn, we can really put the supply chain to the test again and really crank some volume through it.
Yeah, have a few less heartaches than the last couple of years.
Exactly.
That was one of the last questions I had, was sort of advice for people. And I think that was pretty sage advice right there in terms of taking this time. This is the first breather that everyone's had in a couple of years, really, if you want to look at it positively.
Right.
So it is a time to sort of assess everything.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think too on that and on advice and geez, if we had the crystal ball, man, we'd be doing a lot better and a lot more wealthy than what we are today. But advice that I would give to somebody at this point in time is we have to be very mindful of it is changing. And it's not an immediate change. So everybody's not seeing it as this huge, it's flipped. But it is gradually changing. We are seeing some tightness in certain markets again. We're seeing some rates go back up again. And the recommendation is just don't wait too long to get back into those committed, depending on if you have the volumes and stuff, but truckload and intermodal alike. I would say don't wait too long to get into those commitments because, it's been a world where you suffer from having commitments because then you miss out on some of the ups and downs on rates. And I totally get it. And everybody needs to make sure they watch their bottom line. My fear is that as it slowly continues to get better, people are going to get blindsided about not having what are really strong rates right now that you could get committed into, but also just the protection of equipment. And I personally think that's for intermodal and truckload alike. I think that, it's interesting, as Rick mentioned on the intermodal side of things, that, there's a couple big players, and we see on truckload and other modes of transportation that there's mergers and acquisitions and everybody's trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. So all of those, it's not as easy to find those little solutions that used to save the day and get you that, great rate and keep it all the time. And so you just have to be very mindful. We're riding the wave. When is that ideal moment to make that switch and make a commitment for the future? Maybe not for the immediate now, but make that commitment for the future. And I hand it to a lot of shippers. I've heard them come out with that, and you would think they'd be the ones that wouldn't be, trying to ride the wave as long as they could. But I have heard that from some very large shippers that they're now looking to say, okay, well, we need to make sure we're planning for the future, not for the now.
Yeah, value and certainty, really looking ahead.
Yeah.
And I would fall under, similar to what Shelli's saying, work on the strategic relationships, plan for the next disruption, because you never know what it's going to be. And like Shelli was saying, the trucking folks, they're working on their investments. The shippers, logistics companies, what we've seen and what we'd recommend if you're not doing it is invest in your technology now. Now would be a great time to put in technology because you know what is really going to test your systems in the future. What stuff were you missing in the last disruption, or that you feel that would serve you better, that would put a competitive advantage over your competitors? Being a little bit repetitive there, but in any case, so go get some of that money and invest in the technology side. The other piece is don't look internally at what your numbers should be, what your freight budget should be. As you were asking earlier, where can I go find some numbers externally to see what's going on in the market? Pay attention to the market stuff. Don't pay attention to necessarily your bottom line and say, I want to get 10% reduction on my freight, or I want to get 8% reduction. Really shouldn't do that anytime, because, the market could be going down 20% and you were saying, oh, I want to get 10% down. And that's because you're just not looking at the overall market. So as Shelli's saying, we're starting to see some breaks in some areas. And as long as you have an eye to the outside as much as internally, you can protect yourself from being surprised too much.
Well, and you also, just going back to the comparing time as well, you don't want to compare, this is what we spent last year, this is what we should spend this year, especially in the last couple of years. You mentioned 2023 looks a lot like 2019, not like 2022 or 2021.
Yes, very much so.
Well, I think a lot of people are recognizing your suggestion on getting new systems, because our team is working through all of our carriers, I think, are upgrading at the same time, and as well as our customers. And so I think that everybody's recognizing new applications, maybe all at the same time is not as fun, but it is a good recommendation. When things are slower, and technology is one of them, but there's other things, right? That's when you really focus on your processes, your efficiencies. And, when things are crazy and, you're running from, you're burning it on both ends, sometimes things fall through the cracks and you're just like, okay, well, I'll get that later. And you have to find a way to take advantage of the slower times to, systems, processes, procedures, efficiencies. That way you're coming out with full guns when things turn around and you're operating very efficiently.
Yeah, you've just come off a period where you saw what you needed, and now you're at a period where you have time to address it.
Yeah.
Basically.
And it's a lot easier to go ahead, and when you put the new system in, it's a lot easier to be able to test it when the volume is low versus when it's screaming through the system, because it's really hard to catch those little bits and pieces that may not be functioning or communicating properly, either internally or externally. So it's always better to put it in when volumes are lower.
Yeah, not to mention user acceptance, which I think is the hardest thing about a new system, is because I'm one of those. I don't like change, just like anybody else. So I think user acceptance, if you're doing something when it's slower, whereas if it's crazy, I think a lot of people have pushed off or failed on new systems because they just like, we just don't have the time to do this right now.
One thing goes wrong and I'm washing my hands.
And I'm going back. Yeah. So I think that, all of that combined lays it a good picture for doing those types of things during these downturns.
All right. Any other parting thoughts, Shelli, Rick? Anything else that we haven't talked about that you wanted to throw in here?
I'm just ready for that happy catalyst.
Yeah, the happy catalyst.
The happy catalyst.
Sounds
bring
like
it on.
Restaurant, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
Let's bring it on.
All right. Thanks for taking the time, and we'll look forward to seeing what happens next.
All right.
Sounds
Can't wait
good.
to get back and talk about it some more.
Thanks as always for joining us for InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. And thanks very much to Shelli Austin and Rick LaGore for the roundtable discussion. Check out the links in the description to learn more about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And you can help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. If you have questions, email us at podcast@intechlogistics.com. and visit intechfreight-logistics.com for more about what we do. I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll talk to you next time.